So this was very much part of a series of linked shifts away from the 19th century model. It was, I think, a very profound and revolutionary stage in the history of anthropology. I don't think we will ever abandon it, the notion that really we need to be with people where they live in order to find out what they do and think. But this model of research, of ethnography, was very closely linked to what happened to world society in the 20th century. I mean, what happened in the 20th century essentially was that the European empires that had been the driving force in westernization, the formation of world society in the 19th century, were increasingly resisted and ultimately overthrown by nationalist movements coming out of the areas that they had forced into Western world society the century before. And in general, the model of world politics of the 20th century was a national one, as opposed to an imperial one. In other words, the idea that people everywhere have the right to a form of government that expresses who they are without regard to anyone else is a notion that is quite strongly replicated and in some ways reinforced by the ethnographic model of research. I mean, the ethnographic model, at least in its origins, it's been moving for the last 50 years, involved the assumption that people everywhere lived in bounded territories, that they were more or less culturally the same, and that by visiting them we could come up with generalizations about how they normally organize their societies. And this is, without really pushing it too far, a way of discovering nationalism everywhere. The idea that of cultural homogeneity, bounded, exclusive societies, and so forth. Now, since the collapse of empire, after the Second World War, the anti-colonial revolution, this model of ethnography has come under increasing pressure and has evolved in all kinds of creative ways. But it has been my view for some time that if anthropology is to take up the possibilities that exist in the century ahead, we will no longer be able to rely on the ethnographic model as our principal means of defining the subject and its method. In fact, my initial proposition is that we need not only to retain ethnographic method, that is, joining people where they live to find out what they do, but we also need to rediscover the vision of world history that was thrown out by the ethnographic revolution because it was associated with a discredited Western imperialism and racism at the end of the 19th century. And we also need to join up again with the speculative philosophical roots that gave rise to anthropology in the 18th century. Okay, so before I go on to what I believe are some of the possibilities, I need to give a brief account of what I think has happened in the last 50 years. Let's say since the Second World War. It's more than that, 60. I think that what was achieved in the late 40s, which was not just the erection of the United Nations, the building of social democracy in the advanced industrial countries, the realization of an anti-colonial revolution. I mean, the period after the Second World War was one of tremendous human achievement and great belief in the possibility of progress. And I believe if we are looking towards possibilities for building a better world today, then we have to start from the premise that our society has been going downhill since then. In other words, this is obviously, we all have our own views of history. I'm giving you mine. Mine is that I was a beneficiary of my parents' generation, who defeated fascism and installed social democracy, improvements in public services, in education, transport, health, and so forth, that actually provided the launching pad for my own illustrious career. And of course, like most children, I refused to recognize this. I believed that I was the author of my own history and destiny. But it took me, as it were, to reach late middle age before I realized how much I owed my parents after all. But nevertheless, I think it is important when you look at the kind of society that has, I mean, you wouldn't have thought that the society inaugurated by Thatcher could get worse under a Labour government, but it has. And the sheer ugliness of the legislation concerning immigration, for example, is very hard to beat. And the excesses of the neoliberal economy, which we now can see for what they were more clearly, again, I mean, have no real parallel in the 20th century. The nearest parallel to what became normal in Wall Street and the City of London in this decade was the Gilded Age, the 1890s, when financial imperialism had a similar free hand in the world. So for me, I mean, it's very important to look back at what Roosevelt and others achieved in trying to build a better and more progressive world order in the 1940s, that we, to some extent, benefited from consistently in the 50s and 60s and have been in decline from the 1970s. There was a kind of rupture there. But I like to look at this period, the last half century, and I make a claim for it, which supports my predisposition to think of our times as exceptional. I mean, I left Cambridge to go and live in Paris about 12 years ago, and escaping from British academic institutions encouraged me to be bold in the way that I defined my project. And I asked myself, what is it that future generations will be interested in us for? And I mean, what is it about us that's interesting at all? That people in the future will say, now that. So I looked around me, and this was the 1990s, so it wasn't surprising that I formed the conclusion that what was happening was the formation of a new single social network on the planet. That what we were looking at was a process of rapid integration of social relations as a single network, through, of course, the development of the internet, but by other means also. So a lot of my work has been trying to place this this moment, which is at one level a technological revolution, but also carries with it various social causes and consequences, has been trying to place this in modern history, try and get some idea of where we are, as it were. And I looked at two of the previous major technological revolutions, which was the rise of steam power at around 1800, and the rise of and development of electricity grids at the turn of the last century. And I looked at their history and how they unfolded. And in both cases, and a case can be made in relation to the internet revolution, the basic discoveries were made 50 years before they became widely socially applied. So that Boulton and Watt's modification of the steam engine was patented about 50 years before the factories using the steam engine took off in Manchester in the 1820s. Faraday discovered electricity in the 1830s, but it took Edison in the 1880s to turn this into a revolution that could be applied to production and domestic life more generally in society. And that, I mean, the internet is based on inventions made in the Second World War that only truly became widely used socially in the 1990s. And so that's how I place myself in this process.